When retired Marine Sergeant Frank Morrison heard the desperate whinnying outside his remote Montana cabin during the worst blizzard in decades, he initially thought he was hallucinating. But when he opened his door to find 3 wild Mustangs collapsing from exhaustion and hypothermia on his porch, he knew this was no ordinary storm rescue. What he discovered behind these magnificent creatures would shake him to his core and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from nature's darkest moments. This is a story of survival, sacrifice, and a revelation so shocking it would change everything Frank thought he knew about courage. The weather forecasters had called it a bomb cyclone, one of those rare winter storms that would rewrite Montana's record books. For 3 days, the blizzard had pounded the remote wilderness with hurricane-force winds and temperatures that plummeted to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Frank Morrison, a 62-year-old retired Marine, had chosen to ride out the storm alone in his small cabin. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much in Afghanistan's battlefields. Gray hair, cropped military short, pale blue eyes holding that 1,000-yard stare common to combat veterans. For 8 years, Frank had found solace in isolation, far from crowds and noise that triggered unwanted memories. His cabin was heated by a massive stone fireplace, stocked with enough supplies to last months. The power had gone out on day 2, but Frank was prepared. Military training had taught him to expect the unexpected. It was just past midnight on the storm's 3rd night when Frank heard something that shouldn't have been there. Through the howling wind came desperate hoarse sounds, weak and close to his cabin. Frank paused in his reading, setting down his worn Hemingway novel. He'd been hearing strange sounds all evening, the storm playing tricks with the wind. His VA therapist had warned that severe weather could trigger PTSD episodes, causing auditory hallucinations. But the sound came again, clearer this time, definitely from his front porch. Frank moved to the window, brushing aside the heavy curtain to peer into the swirling white chaos. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, but he could swear he saw movement near his door. The whinnying came again, followed by heavy bodies hitting the wooden planks of his porch. Frank grabbed his military flashlight and moved toward the door, heart pounding with disbelief and growing concern. When he opened the heavy wooden door, Arctic wind hit him like a physical blow. What he saw in his flashlight beam stopped him cold. 3 horses, wild Mustangs by their look, lay collapsed on his porch, their bodies steaming in the frigid air, coats caked with ice and snow. The horses were barely conscious, sides heaving with exhaustion and hypothermia. Their eyes held a desperation Frank recognized from his darkest moments. These magnificent creatures were dying, and somehow they had found their way to his door in their final hour. But as Frank stepped closer, his flashlight revealed something in the swirling snow behind the horses that made his blood run cold. There was something else out there, something that explained why these wild animals had risked everything to reach his cabin. What Frank saw next would haunt his dreams and change his life forever. Frank's military training kicked in as he assessed the crisis. The 3 Mustangs were in severe hypothermic shock, shallow breathing, dangerously low body temperatures, ice formed in their manes. Without immediate intervention, they'd be dead within the hour. The lead horse, a magnificent chestnut mare with a white blaze, lifted her head weakly. Her dark eyes met Frank's with what looked like a plea for help. More troubling, she kept turning toward the storm behind her, checking on something in the darkness. The second horse, a smaller gray mare, had collapsed completely, frost covering her eyelashes, lips blue from oxygen deprivation. The third, a young bay stallion, barely more than a colt, shivered so violently his legs couldn't support his weight. Frank made a split-second decision, against all common sense. These were wild animals, unpredictable and dangerous, even weakened. His cabin was built for 1 person, not 3 horses. But something in the chestnut mare's eyes reminded him of Afghan children he'd tried to save. Desperate trust saying, "You're my last hope." "Okay, beautiful," Frank said softly, breath forming clouds. "Let's get you inside before we all freeze." Using combat engineering techniques, Frank dismantled furniture to create space and coax the horses inside. The chestnut mare, whom he called Star for her white marking, walked with support. The gray mare, Storm, had to be pulled on a makeshift sled. The young stallion, Bronze, stumbled inside under his own power. Frank's cabin became a field hospital. He cranked the fireplace to maximum heat, brought out every blanket, and began slowly warming their body temperatures. Too fast meant shock, too slow meant death. As he worked, Frank talked to them like wounded soldiers. "You're safe now. I don't know how you found me, but you're going to be okay." But Frank couldn't shake the image of what he had glimpsed behind them. His flashlight had caught something moving in the darkness, something small and vulnerable. The horses seemed to be protecting. Star seemed to read his thoughts. Despite exhaustion, she kept lifting her head toward the door, whinnying softly, not in pain, but calling. She was trying to communicate something. As dawn broke and the horses stabilized, Frank realized they hadn't stumbled onto his porch by accident. They had come deliberately seeking help, not just for themselves, but for something still out there in the deadly storm. Star's restless behavior made it clear there was still someone who needed rescue. Frank dressed in Arctic gear, loaded emergency supplies, and grabbed rope. If something was out there, he'd be prepared for another rescue. Star struggled to her feet as Frank prepared to leave. Moving toward the door with maternal intensity Frank recognized from protective mothers in war zones. This mare wasn't just concerned. She was desperate to return to whatever she'd been protecting. Against all logic, Frank opened the door and allowed Star to lead him into the storm. Star led Frank through the storm with purpose, following tracks her companions had left in their desperate journey. They traveled 20 minutes, Frank struggling against wind fierce enough to knock him down, while Star pressed on with grim determination. Then Frank saw it. A small horse trailer, white paint making it nearly invisible against the snow, overturned against pine trees. The trailer was crushed, clearly a storm victim. But this wasn't just any trailer. It was the illegal transport kind Frank had heard about on news reports about Mustang trafficking rings. Star led him past the trailer to a small depression in the snow Frank almost missed. There, barely visible beneath ice and snow, was the most heartbreaking sight Frank had ever witnessed. A young foal, probably 3 months old, lay motionless. The tiny horse was silver gray with a black mane. Despite the circumstances, Frank could see it would have been beautiful. Star immediately went to the foal, nuzzling it gently, making unmistakably maternal sounds. Frank knelt beside the small body, expecting the worst. But as he cleared snow from the foal's face, he felt faint, warm breath against his hand. The baby was alive, but barely. Body temperature so low Frank couldn't detect a pulse, breathing almost imperceptible. "Dear God," Frank whispered, understanding flooding through him. Star and her companions hadn't just been fleeing the storm. They'd been protecting this foal, keeping it alive with their body heat and determination. When the cold became unbearable, they made the desperate decision to seek human help, even though every instinct said humans were enemies. Frank looked around the crash site, piecing together what happened. Illegal transporters, caught in the storm, probably moving stolen Mustangs across state lines. The trailer crashed. Most horses died or fled, but Star and 2 others stayed to protect the youngest, most vulnerable member. Frank carefully lifted the nearly frozen foal into his arms. Star watched intensely, and Frank could almost see her making an assessment. After several moments, she made soft, gentle sounds to the baby, the same sounds Frank had heard all morning. "He's telling her I'm okay," Frank realized. "He's giving permission for me to approach." Frank reached slowly toward the baby and started an interference. Her massive head remained close, watching every movement, but she allowed Frank to touch the infant for the first time. The baby was warm. Star's body heat had prevented hypothermia, but clearly dehydrated and weak. Frank could feel her tiny heart beating rapidly. "Got her," Frank called to himself. "She's alive and responsive, but needs immediate care." As Frank stood with the baby in his arms, Star struggled to rise, following step for step as he carried the infant toward home. She never moved more than a few feet away from the child she had risked everything to save. The journey back was a race against time, Frank carrying the tiny foal inside his coat while Star followed, stumbling but determined to see her mission through. But even as they made their way through the blizzard, Frank couldn't shake the feeling there was more to this story than a simple accident. Back at the cabin, Frank's living room became an intensive care unit. While Storm and Bronze huddled near the fireplace, Frank worked frantically to save the tiny foal Star had risked everything to protect. The baby horse, whom Frank called Hope, was in critical condition. Her core body temperature was so low she was essentially in suspended animation. Her tiny heart beating so slowly Frank had to strain to detect it. Military medical training told him hypothermia, this severe, could cause permanent brain damage or death. Frank created a makeshift incubator using his sleeping bag and hot water bottles, carefully controlling the warming process to avoid thermal shock. Star never left Hope's side, using her recovering body heat while making soft, encouraging sounds to the unconscious baby. Hours passed, with Frank more emotionally invested than he'd been in anything since leaving military. Something about Hope's fragile fight reminded him of his own struggles with survival after coming home from war. Like him, she was alone, traumatized, facing impossible odds. "Come on, little one," Frank murmured, monitoring vital signs. "Your mama didn't bring you this far to give up now." By mid-afternoon, Hope showed improvement. Breathing became regular. Frank detected a stronger heartbeat. When her eyes fluttered open and she made a soft sound, Star's response was overwhelming. She nickered with such joy it brought tears to Frank's eyes. But Hope's recovery revealed new challenges. The foal was severely malnourished and dehydrated, clearly without proper nutrition for days. Frank had no experience with infant horses, and his remote location meant no veterinary help until the storm passed. Frank's resourcefulness saved the day. He researched equine care on emergency radio, contacted a town veterinarian who walked him through full care basics over a static fill connection. Using limited supplies, Frank created a feeding system, giving Hope desperately needed nutrition. As night fell and the storm continued, Frank realized his cabin had become something unexpected, a family. Star, Storm, and Bronze had accepted him as part of their herd, while Hope was entirely dependent on both Frank and Star for survival. But the peaceful scene shattered when Frank heard distant vehicle sounds approaching through the storm. Multiple engines, moving slowly but deliberately toward his cabin. Frank's military instincts went on high alert. No legitimate rescue would travel in these conditions, and the timing seemed too coincidental. Star heard the engines too. Her reaction, immediate and terrifying. The mare, who'd been gentle and trusting, suddenly became agitated, moving protectively over Hope while making low warning sounds. Storm and Bronze showed distress, ears pinned back, eyes wide with traumatic fear. Through his window, Frank saw headlights cutting through snow, getting closer. Heavy-duty trucks and trailers, the kind used by people moving large animals under questionable circumstances. Frank realized with growing alarm. These might be the same people transporting Mustangs when the crash occurred. They were coming to clean up evidence, retrieve surviving horses, and eliminate witnesses to their illegal operation. As boots crunched through snow toward his front door, Frank faced a choice defining the rest of his life. He could hand over the horses and pretend he'd seen nothing, or he could stand his ground and protect the animals who'd trusted him with their lives. Frank Morrison reached for his service rifle and prepared to defend his unlikely family. The knock came hard and authoritative at 9:47 p.m., the kind expecting immediate compliance. Frank positioned himself to see both the entrance and his 4 charges, rifle within reach but not obviously displayed. "Open up. Montana Fish and Wildlife." A gruff voice called. "We're here about the horse trailer accident." Frank's trained ear caught inconsistencies. Real wildlife officers would have announced properly, shown badges, and certainly wouldn't operate during a blizzard. These men were pretending to be authorities, but Frank's military experience recognized deception. Star's reaction confirmed his suspicions. Hearing the voice, the mare positioned herself over Hope, her body radiating protective fury. Storm and Bronze flanked her, creating a wall between the door and the tiny foal. Their behavior told Frank everything. These horses recognized mortal threats. "Just a minute," Frank called back, moving to the window for a better look. Through swirling snow, he saw 4 men in heavy coats that looked more tactical than official. 2 trucks with horse trailers parked in his driveway, engines running. Frank assessed quickly. Outnumbered, outgunned, trapped with 4 injured horses, one barely clinging to life. Running was impossible. These men clearly weren't here for friendly wildlife conversation. But Frank Morrison hadn't survived 3 Afghanistan tours by backing down from superior forces. Sometimes the best defense was making enemies believe they were walking into something more dangerous than expected. Frank opened the door just enough to show his face, blocking any view inside. "Gentlemen, this is private property, and you're trespassing. I'll need identification." The lead man, heavy-set with cruel eyes and a scar down his left cheek, stepped forward. "We don't have time for games, old man. We know you've got our horses. Hand them over and nobody gets hurt." "I don't know what you're talking about," Frank replied calmly, hand moving toward his weapon. "I've been alone for 3 days, riding out the storm." "Cut the crap," Scarface snarled. "We tracked them here. 3 mares and a foal worth more than you'll see in a lifetime. Give them up now, or we'll take them with everything else you've got." Behind Frank, Star whinnied softly, not in fear, but encouragement. The mare understood Frank was protecting them, offering support the only way she could. That small sound of trust gave Frank the needed courage. "Here's the thing," Frank said, opening the door wider so the men could see his rifle. "Those horses came to me for help, and I'm not abandoning my responsibilities. You're going to get back in your trucks, drive away, and forget you were here." The men exchanged glances, not expecting resistance from what they'd assumed was an easy mark. Scarface reached inside his coat, but Frank was faster. "I wouldn't," Frank said, rifle now clearly visible. "I'm a decorated Marine veteran with multiple confirmed kills, and I'm having a really bad night. Don't make it worse." The standoff stretched before one man spoke up. "Maybe we should just go, Rick. This isn't worth it." "Shut up," Scarface snapped. "We're not leaving without those horses. They're evidence, and we can't afford witnesses." Frank felt combat instincts fully engage. These weren't just horse thieves. They were prepared to commit murder to protect their operation. "Last chance," Frank said quietly. "Walk away now or deal with consequences." Scarface made his choice. He reached for his weapon, but Frank's training and fury made him faster. His rifle fired, echoing through the storm, followed by Scarface's scream as he fell clutching his shoulder. "Next shot won't be a warning," Frank called out. "Leave now, or I'll make sure you never threaten anyone again." The combination of their wounded leader and Frank's obvious competence finally broke their resolve. They dragged Scarface to a truck and drove into the storm. But Frank knew this wasn't over. They'd be back with reinforcements. As Frank secured his cabin, he realized his quiet retirement was over. He was now part of something larger, a fight to protect innocent lives from people who saw them only as commodities. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, revealing a world transformed by snow and ice. Frank's first priority was getting proper veterinary care for his 4 charges, but he also knew that the men who had threatened them wouldn't give up easily. He needed help, and he needed it fast. Dr. Sarah Chun arrived at Frank's cabin within hours of his emergency call, her all-terrain veterinary truck equipped with everything needed to treat large animals. The Asian-American veterinarian, in her early 40s, had kind eyes and the confident movements of someone who had spent decades working with horses. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Chun said as she examined the horses, "what you've accomplished here is remarkable. These animals should have died from hypothermia, but your care saved their lives." Hope, the tiny foal who had been near death just days before, was now standing on wobbly legs and nursing from Star. The transformation was miraculous, and Dr. Chin shook her head in amazement as she completed her examination. "The foal is going to make a full recovery," she announced. and the three adults are in surprisingly good condition considering their ordeal. But, Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something important. Where exactly did you find them? Frank led Dr. Chun to the crash site where the overturned trailer was now fully exposed in the bright morning sunlight. What they found there would blow the case wide open. The trailer's hidden compartments revealed evidence of a massive illegal operation. False documentation, shipping manifests for black market sales, and communication equipment that suggested this was just one part of a much larger network. Dr. Chen's face grew grim as she examined the evidence. Mr. Morrison, this is bigger than just horse theft, she said. These animals were being shipped to illegal slaughter operations. Star and her family weren't just stolen. They were scheduled to die. Frank felt his anger building as Dr. Chun explained the scope of the operation. Wild Mustangs were being captured illegally, transported across state lines, and sold to foreign buyers who wanted American horse meat. The operation was worth millions of dollars and had been running for years without detection. We need to contact the FBI, Dr. Chun said. This is a federal crime involving interstate trafficking and endangered species violations. But Frank's military mind was already working on a different angle. Dr. Chun, those men who came here, they'll be back, and they're not going to risk leaving witnesses this time. We need to be ready for them. As if summoned by Frank's words, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the wilderness. But this time it wasn't just trucks and trailers. Through his binoculars, Frank could see a convoy of vehicles approaching. At least 6 trucks, plus several ATVs for off-road pursuit. They're not taking any chances this time, Frank observed grimly. Dr. Chun, how quickly can you get Star and her family out of here? Not quickly enough, Dr. Chun replied, studying the approaching convoy. Hope is still too weak for transport, and the others need more recovery time. Frank made another of his characteristic split-second decisions. Then we make our stand here. Dr. Chun, I need you to call for backup. FBI, state police, anyone who can help. I'll hold them off as long as I can. But as Frank prepared his defenses, started something that changed everything. The mare moved to the window and began calling out across the wilderness, not in distress, but in what Frank was beginning to recognize as communication. From the distant hills came answering calls, then more calls. Within minutes, the sound of thundering hooves echoed across the snow-covered landscape as dozens of wild Mustangs appeared on the ridgelines surrounding Frank's cabin. Oh my God, Dr. Chun whispered. The whole herd is coming. Star had done more than just save Hope. She had summoned an army. The Mustangs that surrounded Frank's cabin weren't just random wild horses. They were Star's extended family, the survivors of previous raids by the trafficking ring, and they had come to settle the score. As the traffickers' convoy reached Frank's property, they found themselves facing not just one determined veteran, but an entire herd of wild horses that had had enough of being hunted, captured, and murdered for profit. The final confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time since this adventure started, Frank liked his odds. The battle that erupted around Frank's cabin would later be described by FBI investigators as the most unusual takedown of a criminal organization in Montana history. The trafficking convoy, expecting to overwhelm a single veteran and collect their evidence, instead found themselves surrounded by over 60 wild Mustangs, led by a mare with a personal vendetta and the tactical support of a trained military strategist. Frank had positioned himself on his cabin's roof with his rifle, providing cover and coordination while Star led her extended family in a coordinated assault that would have impressed military planners. The Mustangs didn't attack randomly. They moved with the precision of a pack, cutting off escape routes, overturning vehicles, and systematically dismantling the traffickers' operation. The lead stallion of Star's herd, a massive black Mustang with silver markings, seemed to recognize Scarface from the night before. The confrontation between horse and human was swift and decisive, with Scarface finding himself pinned beneath a 1,000-pound mass of righteous equine fury. Dr. Chun, meanwhile, had successfully reached the FBI, and federal agents were en route by helicopter. But by the time they arrived, the Mustang herd had done most of their work for them. The trafficking ring's vehicles were disabled, their equipment scattered across the snow, and the men themselves were either fleeing on foot or trapped by horses who seemed to understand exactly who the villains were. Agent Maria Santos, the FBI's lead investigator for wildlife crimes, surveyed the scene with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this," she told Frank as they watched the cleanup operation. These horses coordinated their attack like a military unit. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the trafficking operation. The ring had been stealing Mustangs from federal lands for over 5 years, generating millions in illegal profits. Starr's family had been among the most recent victims, captured during a raid that had scattered their herd and left many dead. But Starr had done more than just escape. She had remembered. When the trailer crashed, she had seen an opportunity not just to save Hope, but to lead authorities to the evidence they needed to shut down the entire operation. Hope, the tiny foal whose rescue had started everything, became the symbol of the case. Her survival story captured national attention, and donations poured in to support wild horse protection programs across the country. Frank found himself in an unexpected position. The isolation he had sought after his military service was gone, replaced by a new mission that felt surprisingly familiar. The Department of the Interior offered him a position as a consultant for wild horse protection, and several conservation organizations wanted to partner with him to create a sanctuary on his property. "You know, Starr," Frank said one evening as he sat with the mare and her recovering family, "I came out here to get away from responsibility. Looks like you had other plans for me." Starr's response was to gently nuzzle Frank's shoulder while Hope played nearby, her strength fully returned and her future secure. The other rescued horses had been integrated into a federal protection program, but Starr had made it clear that she and Hope considered Frank's cabin their permanent home. Dr. Chun, who had become a regular visitor and eventually Frank's partner in establishing the Morrison Wild Horse Sanctuary, marveled at the transformation in both man and horses. "Frank, you saved more than just 4 horses that night. You saved an entire species' faith in humanity." 6 months later, the Morrison Sanctuary was home to dozens of rescued Mustangs, with Frank serving as both protector and advocate for animals who had been abused by human greed. Starr had become the unofficial matriarch of the sanctuary, using her remarkable intelligence to help integrate new arrivals and train them to trust humans again. Hope, now a healthy and spirited young horse, had become Frank's constant companion, following him around the property with the devotion of a dog and the curiosity of a child. She showed no signs of the trauma she had endured, having been too young to understand anything except that she was loved and protected. The trafficking ring's leaders received lengthy federal prison sentences, and new legislation was passed to strengthen protection for wild horses. But for Frank, the real victory was simpler and more personal. As he watched Hope race across his pasture while Starr grazed peacefully nearby, Frank realized that his war against nightmares was finally over. He had found his peace, not in isolation, but in purpose, not in forgetting the past, but in building a better future. The veteran who had once felt broken and useless had become the guardian of America's last wild horses. And in saving them, he had saved himself. This incredible story reminds us that sometimes our greatest purpose finds us when we least expect it. Frank's journey from isolated veteran to protector of wild horses shows us that healing comes not from running away from responsibility, but from embracing it in new and meaningful ways. Starr's courage in leading her family to safety and her wisdom in recognizing Frank as an ally proves that animals possess intelligence and emotional depth that we're only beginning to understand. Her trust transformed not just one man's life, but sparked a movement that protects thousands of wild horses across America. This story is a powerful reminder that heroes come in all forms, sometimes as battle-scarred veterans seeking peace, sometimes as wild horses fighting for survival, and sometimes as tiny foals whose very existence inspires others to be better than they thought possible. If this tale touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of hope, resilience, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even in the coldest times, warmth can still be found. And let us know in the comments, what lesson did you take away from Frank and the Mustang's journey? Thank you for joining us today. And remember, sometimes the smallest acts of faith lead to the greatest miracles.